The Barbarian Princess, known for her terrifying curses, knelt in defeat before a human swordsman named Crow. She couldn't believe she was about to lose to someone so ordinary. Crow raised his sword and offered her a choice. Mistaking his words as a question about how she wanted to die, she angrily rejected him. To her shock, he instead proposed taking care of her at his home. Confused and skeptical, she imagined the worst, envisioning herself bound and humiliated. Outraged by the suggestion, she refused with scorn, calling it absurd. Crow sighed, expressing regret as he prepared to strike. She shut her eyes, bracing for death, but instead of pain, she found herself in his arms. Ignoring her refusal, he declared he couldn't kill her because she was simply too cute. His serious tone left her stunned and blushing. Accusing him of mocking her, she received only his earnest denial. Embarrassed and trembling, she cursed him, proclaiming her identity as the Night Black Barbarian Princess, a symbol of wickedness. Crow, unimpressed, asked how that changed his decision, frustrating her further. When he described her as adorable and insisted it was a fact, she struggled to free herself, shouting angrily and demanding to be released. Her resistance was futile, and he held her securely. Humiliated and on the verge of tears, she cursed him again. Gathering her resolve, her headstone began to glow, unleashing destructive energy that shook the entire castle. She declared his doom, laughing as walls crumbled and the roof gave way. No! Despite the chaos, Crow remained calm, holding her tighter as he leapt through the collapsing ruins. Safely escaping, he assured her she was out of danger. Tearful and shaken, she demanded to know why he would go to such lengths. His response remained the same. He had decided to care for her. Carried forward into the dawn, she continued to resist, warning him he'd regret taking the incarnation of a curse. Crow dismissed her concerns, offering words that briefly made her blush, until he obliviously commented on her weight. Mortified, she burst into tears, calling him a fool and insisting he let her go. The great and feared incarnation of curses, now cradled in a human's arms and carried against her will, found the situation utterly humiliating. Glancing at him, Elf asked why he had been staring at her for so long. Her curiosity was met with his explanation that it reminded him of a memory, though the sentiment was quickly ruined when he compared her to a baby goat he once fostered. As they trudged through the dark forest, she cursed his constant insolence. Later, sitting by the campfire, Elf pondered her options. With her curse power depleted, she could only wait for an opportunity to escape. Her eyes wandered to the river where something splashed, and she considered diving in. Before she could act, Crow suddenly unsheathed his sword, his serious demeanor freezing her in place. Assuming he had discovered her plan, she panicked, but his blade came down on a fish instead. He nonchalantly explained it would be their dinner. Though she claimed she wasn't hungry, her traitorous stomach grumbled as the scent of grilled fish wafted through the air. Reluctantly, she set her pride aside, stating she would eat only to show gratitude for his effort, not as an act of acceptance. As she reached for the skewer, Crow stopped her, cooling the fish himself before offering it. Embarrassed and insulted, she yelled at him and took another skewer, stubbornly eating despite the heat burning her tongue. Her anger only grew when she caught him staring at her again. She declined his earlier gesture out of spite, but by the end of the meal she was full and begrudgingly satisfied. Looking up at the moon, Elf hatched a plan. She was confident that no matter how strong Crow was, even he couldn't resist the demon known as sleep. Smirking, she lay down and pretended to rest, ready to make her escape once he succumbed. However, when she woke, it was already morning, the sun shining brightly overhead. Furious, she realized she had been cradled in his arms the entire night. Complaining about his cowardice, she accused him of carrying her while she slept. Crow admitted he had considered waking her but refrained, enchanted by her peaceful, bird-like slumber. Blushing furiously, she lashed out, only to be stunned when he casually revealed she had been asleep for 3 days. Her exhaustion, he explained, was likely due to magical depletion. He apologized for her missing the scenery along the way, but announced they had finally reached his home. Seeing the simple house nestled in the forest, Elf shivered in disbelief, tears brimming as she declared there was absolutely nothing delightful about it. Carried in Crow's arms, Elf muttered curses under her breath, unable to fathom how she'd ended up at his house. The thought of being trapped there forever filled her with dread. But to her surprise, once they arrived, Crow gently set her down and asked her to wait a moment while he cleaned the place. His insistence on prudence left her momentarily baffled, especially when he requested she not peek inside. The door clicked shut, and as soon as he was out of sight, Elf's confusion turned into resolve. This was her chance. She took off running into the forest, silently mocking his foolishness for leaving her unattended. But as she ran deeper into the woods, she suddenly stopped. Glancing back toward the clearing, she hesitated. The silent, dark forest reminded her of the cold, empty halls of the castle she once called home. Shaking her head, she pushed the thought away, questioning her own hesitation. Some time passed, and smoke began rising from Crow's chimney. Finally, the door creaked open, and Crow stepped out, apologizing for the delay. Looking out toward the forest, he saw nothing but emptiness. But then, his eyes fell on Elf, casually sitting on the porch as if she had never left. She justified her return to herself, deciding she'd only come back to remind him how great and wicked she truly was. When Crow invited her inside, Elf followed, her eyes gleaming as she took in the sight of his home. Everything was impeccably clean, a warm glow radiating from the simmering pot in the corner. For a moment, she was mesmerized. Crow snapped her out of it, asking her to take a seat while the meal finished cooking. Trying to mask her awe, she huffed and claimed she'd only give the food a taste. As she moved to sit, Crow stopped her, gesturing toward a small wooden chair, crafted perfectly for a toddler. Her unease deepened as he placed a plate before her, loaded with adorably shaped food, clearly designed for her size. Despite her irritation, the sight of the meal made her stomach growl. It was both nutritious and irresistibly appetizing. Then Crow thanked her. His gratitude caught her off guard, and she immediately deflected, claiming she'd only come back because she was foraging for mushrooms. Ignoring her excuses, they sat down to eat. Crow presented her with a matching set of miniature utensils, causing her to explode in frustration and demand normal. As they ate this simple but delicious meal, Crow broke the silence with an unexpected request. Looking her in the eye, he calmly asked her to take off her clothes. Elf choked on her food, her face burning with embarrassment. In the human's home, the incarnation of curses soaked in a warm bath, letting the water melt her weariness away. Despite the relaxation, irritation bubbled beneath the surface as she recalled Crow's earlier words. Before she'd entered the bathroom, he had casually asked her to take off her clothes and bathe, claiming it would help after her long journey. Elf had scoffed, refusing outright, but his persistence and the jab about her odor had left her momentarily speechless. Those words gnawed at her as she lay submerged in the tub, questioning whether she truly smelled so bad. Later, as night settled in, she returned to the living room wearing an oversized shirt, announcing she'd finished her bath. Ignoring Crow's pleasantries, she bluntly asked about her clothes. To her surprise, he had cleaned them perfectly, even restoring the fluffiness of her coat. But before she could feel any gratitude, Crow made another comment about her scent. Bristling, she cut him off, accusing him of bringing her here just to complain. She finally turned back to him silently, the way she resisted his touch so plainly. Seeing her pout, he chuckled, conceding she might have a point. Still, he admitted he didn't dislike her scent. Quite the opposite. It reminded him of animals in the forest. Insulted by the comparison to wild creatures, Elf glared at him, but Crow quickly brushed past the awkwardness, announcing a surprise waiting for her in the attic. Intrigued but suspicious, she climbed the ladder, warning him not to disappoint her after building her expectations. At the top, she discovered a small bed, clearly crafted just for her. For a moment, she was confused, thinking it was another strange decoration, but curiosity got the better of her. She patted the mattress and ran her hands over the soft sheets. Slowly, her face lit up as she realized how pleasant and fluffy it felt. Crow followed her up and asked what she thought, startling her. Flustered, she claimed she was still assessing it before flopping onto the bed. She rolled around, testing every inch of the mattress, but something felt off. Despite its comfort, she couldn't fully relax. Unaccustomed to such softness after years of sleeping on the cold, hard floors of the castle, noticing her unease, Crow loomed over her with a mischievous glint in his eye. Alarmed, Elf asked what he was planning, but before she could protest, she found herself wrapped snugly in her coat. A sigh of satisfaction escaped her lips as she instinctively curled into the familiar warmth. Trying to hide her delight, she muttered that the bed barely met her standards, though her bashful expression said otherwise. Pleased with her reaction, Crow smiled and moved on, clapping his hands together as he announced his next idea, singing her a lullaby. Horrified, Elf vehemently refused, insisting there was no need for such nonsense. Amused, Crow relented, turning off the light instead. As the room fell into peaceful silence, Elf sank into the soft bed, her guard finally dropping. Crow wished her sweet dreams, knowing he'd need to rise early the next morning. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elf drifted into a deep, comfortable slumber. Dawn broke gently, and a soft voice roused Elf from her peaceful slumber. Still half asleep, she murmured something about being too full to eat more fish. Crow's serious response jolted her awake, and she rubbed her eyes, struggling to fully process his presence. Without warning, he declared his intent to get some milk, and his odd choice of words startled her into alertness. Embarrassed, she instinctively covered herself, glaring at him for his lack of clarity. Later, as they walked through the woods, Elf grumbled about how early they had to leave. Crow shrugged, explaining that morning was the best time to enjoy milk. Realizing they were heading to a nearby village, she began sulking. Stopping in her tracks, she told him it'd be better if he went alone. With her by his side, they wouldn't exactly be welcomed. Crow dismissed her concerns with confidence, insisting there was nothing to worry about as long as they stuck together. His bravado left her stunned and blushing, though she quickly retorted that she didn't need his protection. Ignoring her protests, Crow pressed forward, dragging her along despite her complaints. As they neared their destination, the village remained out of sight. Without warning, Crow scooped her up in his arms. Elf froze, demanding to know what he was doing. But before she could wriggle free, he leapt forward, bounding up a rocky cliff. With each jump, her protest turned into shrieks, but Crow remained unfazed, eventually reaching the windy summit. "Is this your idea of a milk run?" she snapped, glaring at him as the strong winds whipped around them. Crow simply nodded and gestured behind her. Suspicious, Elf turned, only to find herself face to face with an enormous goat. Its calm, piercing gaze made her freeze. Then, without warning, it let out a deep bleat, startling a scream out of her. Crow explained that he'd raised the goat long ago and still visited occasionally to gather milk. Handing her a cup of freshly squeezed warm milk, he asked if she didn't like milk. Elf shook her head, muttering that the goat's menacing glare was the real issue. Crow laughed, insisting it was the opposite, and gestured to a nearby spot. There, two small goatlings bleated happily, bouncing around as they eyed Elf with gleeful curiosity. Surprised, Elf hesitated, but Crow explained that the mother goat only revealed her kids to those she trusted. As if on cue, the goat gave her a gentle, approving smile, as though asking her to watch over her babies. Slowly, Elf crouched down, letting the goatlings nuzzle against her hands. They bleated softly, their warmth and innocence melting her initial discomfort. "Cute?" Crow remarked suddenly, his tone light and teasing. Elf's head snapped up, her face red as she fumbled for a response. She blurted out that she preferred strong, intimidating creatures, but begrudgingly admitted the little goats were charming. "You're not the only cute ones," Crow added, gesturing to the mother goat. Elf scowled, turning her attention back to the kids to avoid his gaze. Crow repeated himself, louder this time, forcing her to stammer out a reluctant agreement, more out of fear than sincerity. Standing abruptly, she huffed about how ridiculous it was for a barbarian princess to be treated this way. But her rant trailed off as her eyes were drawn to the sunrise. The horizon stretched out before her, bathed in golden light, with the mist gradually clearing to reveal its grandeur. For a moment, Elf was speechless, the breathtaking view stealing her words. Accepting Crow's offer at last, she took the cup of milk and drank deeply. A milk mustache lined her upper lip as she raised her head, grinning in delight at the taste. The sunlight continued to spread across the landscape, and as she looked down, she froze. Her voice stuttered in disbelief as she finally spotted it. The massive city sprawled out below them, hidden by the morning mist until now. The breeze carries Elf's hair as she gazes at the bustling city of Urai, her wide eyes taking in the vastness of the trade hub. Known as the City of Free Trade, Urai stands as one of the most influential cities on the continent. Crow, standing beside her, casually remarks that they should get started with their shopping. Elf's mood immediately shifts as she protests, pointing out that her notorious reputation as the incarnation of curses still enforces a curtailment of her thrall into fame and to death. She smirks proudly, puffing out her chest, as if reveling in the dreadful image people have of her. Unbothered, Crow reassures her they'll blend in just fine. Confused but intrigued, she asks what he means, only to realize it's too late. He's already walking ahead, leaving her fuming. As they step through the gates, Elf is greeted by the vibrant sights and sounds of Urai. Races from all over the continent fill the streets, their diversity a stark reminder that she won't stand out as much as she feared. The sunlight reflects off colorful stalls, and the air is filled with the aroma of exotic goods. Her eyes sparkle as she takes in the lively atmosphere, her earlier worries momentarily forgotten. After weaving through the crowd, Crow stops abruptly in front of a shoe shop. Elf blinks in confusion as he announces their first stop. Seeing her puzzled expression, he explains his intention to buy her shoes. She protests, insisting her bare feet are fine, but he counters that shoes would not only protect her but also enhance her appearance. The mention of her appearance catches her attention, and she imagines herself in bold, commanding boots that exude the aura of a barbarian princess. Excited by the idea, she starts browsing, but Crow's first suggestion, a pair of duck-shaped flats, earns a swift rejection. Undeterred, he picks a wild yet adorably fierce pair, but she shoots him down again, claiming it's too far from her desired aesthetic. Frustrated, she leaves him behind to find something herself. As she browses, a shop clerk approaches, having overheard their conversation. The clerk enthusiastically presents a pair of sandals with rough, fur-lined straps and a sturdy leather base. Intrigued, Elf listens as the clerk whispers about the sandals' secret feature, hidden insoles designed to subtly boost the wearer's height. The added touch hooks Elf, and she tries them on, lacing them tightly around her feet. Elf begins to get hungry. Standing tall, well, slightly taller, Elf examines her reflection, puffing out her chest with pride. She declares her new form superior, letting out a triumphant laugh. Crow joins her, his usual unvaried comment calling her adorable, grating on her nerves yet again. Still, when he mentions she does look taller, a rare compliment, her face lights up with satisfaction. They purchase the sandals and head back out, but as they leave, the clerk calls after Elf, teasing her about her nice boyfriend. Flustered, Elf stammers out a denial, calling Crow a mere pillager. Her cheeks flush as Crow looks on, clearly amused by her reaction. In the heart of the city, Elf glanced around aimlessly, blinking as she asked where they were. Crow explained it was one of Urai's many bustling squares, with street stalls teeming with goods that fuel the city's thriving economy. Elf sniffed the air, catching a spicy scent lingering nearby, and pointed toward a stall. It was a flame potato vendor, a spot notorious for its fiery snacks. Crow immediately waved it off, saying the food was far too spicy for his tastes. Elf's eyes gleamed mischievously. Seizing the chance to flaunt her toughness, she ordered a portion of the infamous potatoes. Crow raised an eyebrow and asked if she was sure, warning her again about their intense heat. Undeterred, she snatched the snack from him, declaring boldly that nothing could be too spicy for someone of her stature. Confidently popping one into her mouth, she chewed with a smug grin, imagining his awe at her resilience. Appearance. Reality hit hard. Her mouth burned like an inferno, and she gagged as her face turned red. Still, she stubbornly insisted between gasps that it tasted amazing. Crow, unimpressed, told her to enjoy her meal on the side while he went to buy ingredients. Unable to endure the heat, she silently cursed the snack and contemplated tossing the offending potatoes into the trash. Just as she was about to dispose of them, a voice startled her. A small child stood nearby, asking why she was wasting food. Elf raised an eyebrow, questioning the girl's presence and urging her to go home. But the child remained firm, explaining she'd been taught never to waste food. Elf smirked, puffing her chest and announcing that as a barbarian princess, she didn't care about such trivialities and would waste food whenever she pleased. However, her grand proclamation went completely over the child's head. Frustrated, Elf simplified her words, even going so far as to call herself evil and urging the girl to run along to her parents. Yet, instead of fleeing, the child admitted, trembling, that she couldn't find her mother. Elf froze, her bravado faltering as she processed the situation. Finally, she crouched to the child's level, gently patting her head and offering quiet reassurance that they'd find her mother together. When Crow returned, she explained what had happened, and he quickly devised a plan. Before they set off, however, he glanced at Elf's hand holding the child's and remarked how kind she truly was. Blushing furiously, Elf looked away, muttering that she was simply acting on a whim. Announcements echoed through the crowded streets as they searched for the girl's mother. The child perched on Crow's shoulders, her small voice calling for her parent while he projected her message above the noise. Time passed, but their efforts finally bore fruit when someone called out to them. The child's teary eyes lit up as her mother came into view, and the two were reunited in an emotional embrace. As thanks were exchanged, the little girl ran back to Elf and hugged her tightly, calling her the kind, wicked sister and thanking her for her help. Flustered but secretly pleased, Elf waved as they parted ways. As they walked back through the square, Crow glanced at the potatoes Elf still held and asked if he could have them, mentioning that he'd had the vendor make a milder batch. He also handed her a lollipop, claiming it was to cleanse her palate. Elf bristled, realizing he'd anticipated her failure all along, but begrudgingly accepted the candy. Sucking on the sweet treat, she resolved to plot her revenge for tomorrow, a sly grin tugging at her lips. A new morning broke, and Elf greeted the day with a long, satisfying stretch. Rubbing her eyes sleepily, she sat up and spotted Crow across the room. A wicked smile slowly spread across her face. It was finally time. There was something she just couldn't accept, and that was the fact that she had lost their last battle. But now, her strength was fully restored, and she could sense that Crow had let his guard down. With stealth in her step, she crept out of bed, planning her moment of vengeance. This was the perfect opportunity to pay him back. A single curse, and she could make him submit. With a determined glare, she raised her hands and let the words of the curse slip from her lips. She channeled all her power into the spell, wishing him the worst stomach ache imaginable. However, to her surprise, Crow simply turned around, gave her a cheerful good morning, and casually asked why she was standing like that. He then returned to his duties in the kitchen, completely unaffected. Elf froze, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. She repeated his words, her mind racing to understand why her curse hadn't worked. Could he have some kind of resistance to curses? A sudden memory flashed in her mind of the many times she had found herself in unfortunate situations. Realization dawned on her. Her curses were being turned back on her. Her stomach suddenly gave a loud rumble, followed by sharp, stabbing pain. It felt as if her own curse had been redirected. Grumbling under her breath, she staggered to her bed, curling up in discomfort. She muttered that she was fine, but Crow, now concerned, insisted it might have been something he'd cooked for them. Without asking for her opinion, he rushed off to find a healer in the city. Elf, left alone, slumped onto the bed, her annoyance growing. She turned to notice the sheets had a distinct scent, one that reminded her of him, and for a moment she let herself sink into the soft comfort. Her eyelids grew heavy, and soon she drifted off into a fitful sleep. She awoke later to the sound of a bright voice. Someone was speaking to her. Startled, Elf blinked and found herself face to face with a cheerful woman. The healer, having just entered, greeted her with a bright smile and asked how she was feeling. Elf, still groggy, recalled Crow's departure and realized the healer must have been the reason he left so quickly. As the healer examined her, Elf shifted uncomfortably, and suddenly the woman froze in shock. She stared at Elf's stomach, her expression changing. "What's wrong?" Elf asked, uneasy. The healer's response took Elf by surprise. "You're far too cute," she exclaimed, causing Elf to blush and shift awkwardly. Quickly brushing it off, the healer moved on, her hands gently pressing against Elf's belly as she continued her examination. The healer paused again, her brow furrowing. What's this I feel?" she muttered, her tone slightly concerned. She hesitated before speaking up again. "It seems you've been cursed. It's different from what I expected. It doesn't seem to be malicious at all." Elf felt a wave of embarrassment and looked away, not wanting to explain herself. Crow, ever the observant one, offered his own theory. "It must be because of her cuteness," he said with a slight grin. But the healer disagreed, sensing something unusual about the curse. There was no malice in it, only hesitation. Elf awkwardly shifted again as the healer prepared to dispel the curse. A soft magic circle materialized in the healer's palm, and with a wave, she sent the curse dissipating into the air. She smiled at Elf, her expression still puzzled but calm. "I'm not sure what to think," the healer admitted, "but now I'm certain that something powerful is lurking within you. It feels ominous." Elf's patience was wearing thin. "How long are you going to keep touching me?" she asked, a little too sharp for her liking. But the healer only chuckled, her fingers still lightly pressing against Elf's stomach. The tension in the room lightened when Elf couldn't help but laugh, feeling ticklish at the healer's touch. "I've got a small request in exchange for all this help," she said suddenly, leaving Elf surprised. What kind of request could the healer have? The three of them walked through the city, as Mena, the healer, shared that she had only arrived 2 days ago from Belissos in the north. The great and wicked elf grumbled, questioning why she had to humor the lady's request to find a good restaurant. Mena insisted that it wasn't silly, but rather the most important thing when in a new place, and added that she was glad the girl had come. Crow, however, found a problem as he struggled to find a place with both good food and cute ornaments. Elf scolded him, telling him to focus on finding good food, her frustration evident. Mena, in a joking tone, mentioned something about eating a puffy elf, but the man tried to consider her preferences. The girl, however, snapped that they just needed to find something edible. They then decided to check out the street stalls near the fish market, known for their seafood. It was said to be the best way to experience the city, eating while moving through it. Elf couldn't resist the fresh dishes at the stalls, but Mena called her over, holding up a few mysterious fried foods for them to try. Unsure whether it was safe to eat, they hesitated before munching on them, surprised by their crunchy texture and satisfying taste. Crow, observing them, identified the dish and teased them, calling them connoisseurs. He pointed to an unattractive fish nearby, noting that many were reluctant to try it despite its good taste. Surprisingly, the two didn't mind and even found it intriguing. They continued walking, trying different dishes along the way. Eventually, the two ladies were completely full and expressed their gratitude to the sea for the delightful meal. Elf, however, teased Mina for exaggerating, though Mina insisted it had been a wonderful day, marking the day she met a good friend. Before Elf could clarify or reject the notion, Mina had already considered them friends. Elf protested, saying she didn't need a friend, but Mina admitted that she'd been feeling lonely after moving to the new place. Elf fell silent at the sincerity in her smile. While the friendship wasn't solidified, Elf agreed to go shopping again sometime, prompting Mena to hug her tightly, dropping the honorifics. For some reason, Mena said everything would be fine, which confused Elf. Mena kept breathing heavily while holding her, claiming she had made a major discovery but refused to explain, instead sniffing Elf's head and commenting that it smelled soothing. Crow interrupted, asking Mena if she had decided on a career path and if she'd be interested in helping with his work. Mena appreciated the offer, asking why, to which he explained that it was so the two girls could form a deeper bond over time. She gladly accepted, rubbing her face against Elf's. Meanwhile, Elf realized that his words meant she was likely required to help him as well. The three arrived at the North District's quest agency where Crow worked. He offered to introduce them, but Elf immediately rejected the idea, vehemently against helping their cause and insisting that Crow had to go with the dainty doctor instead. However, Crow had a specific reason to visit and wasn't bringing them in this time. He told them to wait outside, which piqued the girls' curiosity. Elf saw it as an opportunity to find the swordsman's weakness and agreed to wait while Crow headed in, promising to settle things quickly. Mena wondered what they could do to pass the time, but suddenly noticed Elf snooping around, following Crow. Somehow both ended up tailing him, with Elf determined to uncover his secret. However, the place they were in was known as a dangerous bounty hunter's den. Fortunately, Elf had an idea. She asked Mena for a favor and donned the human girl's cape, believing it would be the perfect disguise. As Elf peeked around columns, the other bounty hunters stared at Crow in awe. His reputation surprised them, and one man, noticing their blank expressions, explained that they must not know him. To the locals, Crow was known as the man overblessed by the goddess. His blessing, a miraculous power that granted special abilities, was legendary and beyond compare. Crow constantly took on brutal quests and had never failed one. As Crow made his quest report, the receptionist immediately took out his reward, but he declined it. Confused, she asked if the quest had no reward, but Crow simply said he had failed. The entire agency was shocked, and the receptionist was in disbelief. They started discussing which quest it might have been, one mentioning the subjugation of the Barbarian Princess. Elf watched as Crow was asked if she had been that strong of an opponent. He confirmed, saying his mind had gone blank the moment he saw her. His body heated up, and his chest tightened. The receptionist misinterpreted his words, relieved that he was still alive and asking about his future plans. Crow announced that he was prepared to dedicate everything to her, which she misunderstood as a desire for revenge. From behind, Menace shared her surprise at how strong the Barbarian Princess must have been, oblivious to the fact that she was friends with her. Meanwhile, Elf, hiding under the coat, trembled and blushed in embarrassment, cursing Crow for his words. Her heart thumped as they sat on the stairs, waiting for him to return. Despite thinking he was amazing, Elf was still in denial. When Crow returned, he mentioned that he found a couple of quests that might interest them. When asked about them, he turned the question back on them, asking if they preferred the mountain or the sea. Elf was confused, but Crow explained that he planned on completing them alone and just wanted to know their preferences for the scenery. As usual, Mena excitedly raised her hand, choosing the mountain. At night, Elf curses Crow during her bath, annoyed by how he wants to complete quests while they sightsee. But being the wise one she is, she decides to ignore his nonsense and focus on her plan to prove she's stronger than him. She steps outside later and heads to the main house, unaware that something is watching her from the woods. As she enters, she's shocked to find Crow carrying a few items strung together. He explains that he's doing packing rehearsals, so she questions why he's carrying her bed. He insists the mat is too hard and refuses to leave the bed. She orders him to leave it, regardless of his objections. Meanwhile, Mena is in her room, gleefully looking out the window. She's preparing for the quest and has taken out a big old book, claiming it's an ancient grimoire manuscript. She believes the origin species were ancestors of dark elves who established ancient sorcery. Soon, she notices a stone etched into Elf's body. It's a common shape, so it might just be a coincidence, but when she reads the meaning behind the mark, she's taken by surprise. Later, Crow admits he's worried, knowing he can't maintain the same standard of water. He even asks if he can bring her chair with him. Slightly irked, Elf turns away, remarking that he didn't have luggage during her subjugation. However, things have changed, and she's now his biggest priority. Blushing and trembling, she turns away and stomps outside. She tells him to stop pestering her, saying she just needs to cool down. Everything but Crow warns her against it, as the forest night is full of danger. He continues to list the reasons why she should stay inside, and Elf takes on a sinister expression, saying they seem to have forgotten the darkness inside her. She screams her title into the air, but her ill-fitting clothes nearly fall off as she cackles. Annoyed, she stomps outside again. Suddenly, she bumps into something, looking up to find a huge ogre watching her from above, ready to attack.